Hello and welcome back. This is the second part of a video series on how to make your own Oldhammer battlefield. The first one was mainly construction of all the terrain pieces, and in this one I'm gonna paint and flock everything and make it look like the Oldhammer battlefields from the old White Dwarfs from the 80s and 90s that you, hopefully like me, remember very fondly. Hope you enjoy it. I undercoat most of my terrain pieces with spray cans. It's fast and it saves a lot of time, but detailing is mostly done by airbrush. Here I base coated with the Mechanica Standard Grey from Games Workshop spray can, and then I use the airbrush with a light brown color here just to pick out the dirt and not trying to hit the rocks. Most of this is going to be covered by flock later on, so it's not going to be too visible, but it's nice to create some variation here. Just a nice dirt color that's going to be washed later on. The wheat field was sprayed with leather brown spray from Army Painter, good coverage, and then after that I gave it a dusting of Zandri dust spray from Games Workshop, just to give it a nice highlight. The riverbanks were sprayed with the same leather brown I used for the wheat field. Spray cans saves a lot of time, so if you can, use them, but I mean, brushwork is fine and probably a lot cheaper, but it takes longer. But just try not to hit the other elements. It's actually possible with spray cans. If you just careful, you can hit where you want and leave the other stuff unpainted. So the bridge actually just needed slight touch-ups after this. And after the brown, I just put on some Death Guard green from Games Workshop, just to create a kind of a mossy appearance. And you know, riverbanks are often covered by vegetation and moss and algae, so a little green paint there, and an ultramarine blue for the water. It turned out a little bit too bright blue. It's kind of a fantasy river, so I guess it's alright, but I would have chosen another color if I did it again, and I'm probably gonna do this again. So maybe a darker blue and green would be nicer. Dry brushing the riverbanks with the beige acrylic paint, cheap, that I found in a hobby shop. I'm using this for both the riverbanks and the bridge. I usually do this just to tie stuff together. It looks good, and it makes terrain pieces kind of look more natural if they have the kind of same lighting effect that dry brushing is on everything. It's not good for blue and green, but for earthy tones and gray it's really good, so I'm trying to use it for everything, and just trying not to hit the blue parts of the water here. I mixed some brown acrylic paint with water to create a wash that I used on the riverbanks to create some shade here. They look a bit flat when only sprayed and dry brushed, so just to create some more interest, I washed all the riverbanks with this. For the water effects, I'm using Liquitex acrylic medium. It's gloss and it's thick and stays in the shape you make it with the brush later on. So I'm just pouring on as much as I can here, just all over the blue parts of the river, and then I'm using a big brush to spread it out, but also to make a wavy pattern. So you shouldn't paint it on, you should stipple it until it makes little waves and ripples on the water here. So just take your time. This takes a long time to dry, so you don't have to hurry too much, and just stipple it out all over the blue and a little bit almost up into the banks, and just redo where you don't like it. You can also do this with an airbrush. You can push air through it to create ripples. I've seen it done, but I haven't tried it myself. But if you feel adventurous, you can do that. But I've seen it done with ice cream popsicle sticks and stuff like that, but I prefer a brush because it's a bit faster and it creates this kind of windy, wind-torn ripple effect, almost like it's blowing hard on it. For the hills, I'm just painting another layer of the green paint all over it, being as quick as I can, but covering everything. You have to really cover the whole hill in one go, because when you're pouring on the static grass, you can't do that in two goes, because it will leave a seam and stuff like that. So just try to be fast here and pour as much grass here as you can all over it and push it into the paint. Some of the hills I did with paint, and some of the hills I did with some watered down PVA. I think the PVA might be actually better, but both works here. So just try to push as much grass as you can into the paint or glue, and then tap it off when it's dry. So leave it on, don't tap it off immediately. But it creates a nice grassy hill here, and I don't have to use a static grass applicator because that takes forever. The same thing was done to the forest bases. I just painted them green first and then let them dry off until I had the time to apply the static grass to them. I was doing all this at once, so some things were done in weird order, but I've tried to edit it together in the right order here. So on with the watered down PVA glue all over the base in one go, and be careful to not miss any parts or get glue on the rocks, because you don't want grass there. So just be careful and use an old brush that you're not too fond of, and then be sure to hit all the edges but not the underside. So this takes a bit of practice, but it's fine, and you'll get a hang of it pretty quickly. And then on with static grass again, and just push it in and then tap it off and leave it to dry. For the farm, I used the same brown paint mixed with water to just give a nice base coat to all the courtyard gravel and dirt here, just being careful not to hit the walls or the buildings, just the ground here, and a little bit outside of the gate, and just being careful to cover everything and to soak it into the gravel so it stays in place. Nice layer of paint will do that, so that prevents damage from when you game on it. All the stonework and the ground was dry brushed with a beige, same as the river parts, and then a white dry brush over the stonework. And I picked out the wood here on the smithy with some green airbrush paint. I think it's Dark Angels green, and just to create some interest. The other building is going to be brown wood, but this is green. A lot of old buildings in the Warhammer rule books were dark green and dark red and stuff like that. I think it looks nice and interesting, so just carefully picked out all the wood work here with green, and just with an old brush. You don't have to be too careful, because I mean, you're gonna dry brush and wash and stuff like that all over. The wood parts for the brown wood was just base coated with also here an airbrush color. They're really good for painting terrain, because they have good coverage and they're kind of thinned, so you don't have to thin them with water. Maybe it's a bit expensive, but I had them lying around, so I just used them for this. Once again, for the roof, I'm using airbrush colors. This is a black airbrush primer from Vallejo, and it has very good coverage and it flows really nicely, so it can be applied with a brush also. And using an airbrush here, I had big risk of hitting other parts, so I just used a brush here. And then the chimney was painted grey. painted the doors red with a kind of a brownish red airbrush paint to create some interest, and then the plaster was painted with a beige tone here. It's going to be washed and then dry brushed, so it will get a little bit more interesting than this, but I think beige is a good starting point for plaster or stucco. Just be careful not to hit the rocks or the wood parts here. I then dry brushed the green wood with the light green paint here with a medium dry brush, not to hit the other parts, just the green parts, because you don't want that on the rocks or the other wood parts. And then on with the beige paint for wood and a blue-gray paint for the roofs. And then onto the same trick as I always use, the light beige paint for everything, just pulling it together once again, and just getting a nice kind of high contrast dry brush here all over. For the brown wood parts and around chimneys and stuff like that, I used Agrex Earthshade. I usually don't use these washes on terrain because they're so expensive and you use so much of it, but there were not too many parts that you needed this wash, so I did that to save some time, and it's really good wash. So I mean, the result is better than an acrylic and water mix that you make yourself, but I used it on the building here, and just using a paper towel to remove excess is really good, but you have to be kind of fast before, so you don't let it dry. The windows were just painted black this time. You can probably do a little bit more detail on them because they have like bars and stuff like that, but I settled for black to save some time this time. Final step on the farm was just light dry brush of white paint along the edges and stuff like that, so just to create some crispness and just tie stuff together. Careful not with a too big brush, just picking out where you kind of forgot to bring out the detail and the textures. The wheat was dry brushed with the same beige paint again, and as you can see in the background, I dry brushed the walls and the ground and put on static grass on the outside of the walls there, and just getting a nice texture here. You can dry brush this forever and it just looks better and better. And for the walls, I kind of wasn't satisfied with the seams on some places, and I just used some PVA glue and some flock here to cover these, to create some moss effect on the walls. It covers most mistakes, so you can always do that. And then onto the Wizard Tower Hill here. You're gonna get tired of me dry brushing with beige, but that's just what I do. So again, all over the rocks, all over the dirt here, and just moving on. It's actually a lot of fun to dry brush. So that's why I'm doing it a lot, and the terrain is really satisfying to see the textures just appearing when you dry brush. It's just you have to get the technique right. You have to really wipe a lot of paint off and just do it in steps instead of slathering it on. That creates a really nasty effect. And so get good dry brush. I use Games Workshop's terrain dry brush. I think they're really good, so I use those for large terrain pieces like this. The wood parts just got a wash after the dry brush, just a brown wash, and it looks super nice. So it doesn't have to be so complicated when doing terrain. You can just cheat a lot of steps here. But white paint on the rocks here, on the stone parts, just to set them apart from the dirt. So just a light dry brush of white to pick out the details here, and it looks really nice. Somehow I missed to film when I washed the wood here with brown, but I guess you can figure out how to do that yourself. But after that I mixed brown and black paint with water and created a wash that I just painted everywhere, just to bring everything down a little bit and bring it together. It's supposed to be an old abandoned tower, so I like this kind of dark wash all over, and creating more contrast and more shadows. To create a really mossy, old, overgrown look, I used the watered down PVA again, and I just picked out places where I thought there would be vegetation and moss, and just kind of quickly applying this to actually all over the stone parts on top of walls and stuff like that, also to create a mossy effect on the tower. And then just spreading flock, dark green flock here everywhere, and just pushing into the glue, and then trying to tap off as much as you can to save for another day. And then the edges painted again with a green wall paint, just trying not to hit the rocks and the parts you already covered with moss. Just use a medium-sized brush here, and again be quick, because this paint, when it dries, it doesn't take the static grass. So just try to be quick, and then pour on the grass here on the edges to tie it into the board. And again, try to save as much as you can by tapping it off and pouring it back into the container. Static grass is not free. Moving on to the last part of the build, and the most fun part, just putting on the detail and the little plants and grass tufts and stuff like that, and small trees. I have a large selection of these things. They can be bought from most railway shops or hobby shops, and I just keep a stash of different clump foliage and grass tufts and small plants that I can use on both miniatures and terrain. But this is a bit time consuming, but it's a lot of fun, and you have to work kind of a bit random, because you don't want to create patterns, and you have to make it look natural. I spend a lot of time when traveling checking out old ruins and stuff like that to see how stuff grows on them, and just watching other hobby channels just to get inspiration. And this is just so rewarding and so much fun to watch the piece come alive. And the trees are small pine trees for this hill here that I just drill holes and use PVA and stick them into. They just have some wire frames that for trunks, so I just stick them in there. And lastly, for the rock formations, I do the same again. I'm just moss and flock, and then static grass, and then just small plants wherever you think there should be. And just these turned out so much better than I thought, and I really recommend them, because these rock molds are really easy to use with plaster, and yeah, they look very nice. And just clump foliage as bushes, and then again some small trees here that I just drilled and stuck them into with PVA glue. And that's it for the build, and now you're gonna see how it turned out. I hope you think it looks a little bit like back in the day, and I'm really happy with the result.